If you arrive in Pattaya today for the first time, nothing immediately feels broken. The roads are still active, hotels are still operating, and the beachfront still draws people out in the evenings. On paper, it looks like a city that's functioning normally. But tourism isn't judged on functionality, it's judged on feeling. And the feeling Pattaya gives new visitors today is very different from what its reputation suggests. For decades, Pattaya was known as a place that announced itself the moment you arrived. There was noise, movement, and a sense that the city never really paused. You didn't need to search for energy, it found you. Today, that experience is inconsistent. One street might feel active, while the next feels unusually quiet, even during hours that used to be reliably busy. For first-time visitors, that contrast creates uncertainty. People start second-guessing themselves early on. Is this area already past its prime? Am I here at the wrong time? Was Pattaya always like this? Those questions don't come from disappointment alone. They come from confusion. What makes this more noticeable is expectation. Pattaya's image was built years ago, and it still carries that image into the present. New tourists arrive expecting intensity and constant activity, but what they often experience is something slower and more fragmented. Not empty, but uneven. Not dead, but subdued. That unevenness matters. Tourists don't explore a city evenly. They follow momentum. When energy doesn't carry from one area to the next, excitement fades quickly. The city stops feeling immersive and starts feeling segmented. Pattaya doesn't push visitors away outright. Instead, it fails to pull them in. The first impression no longer overwhelms or excites. It hesitates. And in tourism, hesitation is often the moment when people quietly decide that this probably isn't a place they need to return to. Most people don't arrive in Pattaya without expectations. Even first-time visitors come with a mental picture shaped by years of reputation, stories, and online content. Pattaya has long been associated with crowds, energy, and a sense that something is always happening, day or night. Those expectations aren't entirely wrong. They're just no longer reliable. Pattaya today still has activity, but it doesn't appear the way many visitors imagine. Bars are open, but not packed. Restaurants are operating, but half full. Nightlife areas still glow with neon, yet the streets beneath them don't always match the brightness above. The city delivers fragments of what people expect, but rarely the full picture. For returning visitors, the contrast is immediate. People who remember Pattaya from 10 or 15 years ago notice that the crowds don't build the same way. The noise doesn't travel as far. The excitement feels contained rather than contagious. What once felt effortless now feels selective, depending on the time, the street, or even the night of the week. First-time visitors experience the gap differently. Nothing is bad enough to complain about, but nothing feels extraordinary either. They walk through areas that look designed for far more people than are actually there. They sense that something is missing, even if they can't clearly define what it is. That mismatch creates a quiet form of disappointment, not the kind that leads to anger or negative reviews, but the kind that lowers emotional attachment. Pattaya becomes a place that feels interesting to see once, rather than a place that pulls people back. In tourism, expectations do most of the work. When reality consistently under-delivers, even slightly, people adjust their future plans without making a big deal out of it. They simply choose a different destination next time. Pattaya doesn't fail visitors outright, it just doesn't live up to the version of itself that still exists in people's minds. And when expectation and reality stop aligning, the decision not to return often happens quietly long before anyone ever says it out loud. Pattaya still functions as a city, but it no longer moves with the same confidence it once did. There isn't a dramatic moment where things clearly go wrong. Instead, the change shows up in how the city feels. It's subtle, gradual, and easy to miss unless you're paying attention. In the past, Pattaya's atmosphere felt unavoidable. Energy flowed naturally from one street to the next. Noise carried. Crowds pulled you forward without needing a plan. Today, that momentum doesn't build in the same way. Activity exists, but it stays contained. One block might feel lively, while the next feels unusually quiet, even during hours that used to be consistently busy. That inconsistency affects how visitors experience the city. Tourists don't move through Pattaya evenly. They follow energy. When momentum stops abruptly, exploration slows down. People pause, look around, and then keep moving, rather than being drawn deeper into the area. The shift becomes more noticeable in small details. Music plays at lower volumes. Businesses remain open without urgency. Staff wait instead of actively engaging. The city feels like it's conserving energy rather than releasing it. These aren't signs of collapse, they're signs of caution. Atmosphere matters more than attractions. A destination can have nightlife, beaches, and infrastructure, but if it doesn't feel immersive, visitors disengage. Pattaya still has activity, but it no longer surrounds you the way it once did. Even busy areas can feel strangely flat when the energy doesn't spill beyond their borders. What Pattaya has lost isn't any single feature. It's rhythm. The natural buildup of excitement that once defined the city now struggles to form. When that rhythm disappears, visitors might not consciously notice it, but they feel its absence immediately. A city can survive changes, renovations, and shifting audiences. But when it stops generating momentum on its own, the emotional connection weakens. Pattaya doesn't push people away, it simply fails to energize them. And without that spark, excitement fades long before visitors ever decide whether they'll return. For many travelers, the decision to return to a place isn't emotional at first. It's practical. They ask themselves whether the experience felt worth the time and money they invested, and this is where Pattaya quietly struggles. Costs have risen over the years, as they have almost everywhere. Hotels, food, transportation, and entertainment are no longer as cheap as people remember. On its own, that isn't unusual. The issue is how those higher prices translate into experience. When visitors compare Pattaya to other destinations in Thailand, the differences become noticeable. Phuket offers scenery and resort-style experiences. Chiang Mai offers culture and a slower pace. Even smaller cities now feel more curated, with clearer identities and better-defined attractions. Pattaya, by comparison, feels less certain about what it's offering. The city still has plenty to do, but much of it feels familiar rather than distinctive. Visitors don't always feel like they're getting something they couldn't find elsewhere. When experiences start to feel interchangeable, value becomes harder to justify. This doesn't lead to complaints. Most tourists don't feel cheated or disappointed enough to speak out. Instead, they quietly adjust their expectations. Pattaya becomes a place that feels acceptable but not compelling. A destination that works but doesn't stand out. Value in tourism isn't just about price. It's about how memorable the experience feels. People are willing to spend more if the place leaves a strong impression. When that impression fades, even reasonable costs can feel high. Over time, this calculation influences behavior. Travelers who might have returned every few years begin exploring other options. Pattaya slips lower on the list, not because it failed, but because it no longer feels like the best use of a limited travel budget. This is how destinations lose repeat visitors without ever seeing a sudden drop. The value question doesn't get asked once. It gets asked every time someone plans a trip. And increasingly, Pattaya isn't the answer it used to be. One of Pattaya's biggest challenges today isn't something visitors see. It's something they arrive with. The city's reputation was built decades ago, and it hasn't evolved at the same pace as the place itself. For years, Pattaya was known for a very specific image. Even people who had never visited carried a clear idea of what the city represented. That image shaped expectations, travel plans, and even who chose to come in the first place. But as Pattaya changed, that image stayed frozen in time. New travelers often arrive unsure of what Pattaya is supposed to be now. Is it a nightlife city? A beach destination? A family-friendly resort town? A long-term living hub? The city contains elements of all of these, but it doesn't clearly commit to any single one. That lack of clarity affects first-time visitors most. When people don't understand what a place is trying to offer, it's harder for them to connect with it emotionally. They move through the city without a strong narrative, unsure of how to interpret what they're seeing. At the same time, the audience Pattaya was originally built for has gradually moved on. Tastes changed. Travel options expanded. New destinations emerged that felt more aligned with modern expectations. Pattaya didn't lose its old audience overnight. It slowly stopped being their first choice. The problem is that the new generation of travelers hasn't fully replaced them. Many younger tourists look for places with clearer identities, stronger aesthetics, or experiences that feel more intentional. Pattaya's mixed signals make it harder to stand out in that environment. A destination can survive change, but it struggles when its story becomes unclear. Pattaya isn't failing because it lacks attractions. It's struggling because people don't quite know how to frame it anymore. When a place loses control of its narrative, visitors fill in the gaps themselves, and more often than not, that uncertainty is enough to make them look elsewhere. Pattaya didn't change all at once. There wasn't a single event that marked the end of its popularity, and there wasn't a clear moment when visitors suddenly stopped coming. The shift happened quietly over time, in ways that were easy to overlook. At first, the changes were small: one less busy season, slightly thinner crowds, a few familiar places closing without much attention. None of it felt alarming on its own. Pattaya still worked. Tourists still arrived. Life continued. But gradual change has a way of compounding. What once felt like a temporary dip slowly became the new normal. Streets that used to feel reliably busy started to feel unpredictable. Certain areas became quieter earlier in the evening. Peak times stopped feeling as crowded as people remembered. For returning visitors, the shift was subtle but noticeable. Each visit felt just a little different from the last. Not worse in an obvious way, but less intense, less full, less urgent. Over time, those small differences added up. For first-time visitors, the effect was different. They didn't see decline. They simply experienced a city that didn't quite live up to its reputation. They had nothing to compare it to, but they sensed the mismatch between expectation and reality. This is what makes gradual change difficult to reverse. There's no single problem to fix, no moment to point to and say this is when things went wrong. The city didn't collapse. It slowly adjusted and in doing so lost some of the qualities that made it feel distinctive. Tourism depends on momentum. Once that momentum slows, it takes more effort to rebuild excitement than it did to maintain it. Pattaya's challenge isn't that people stopped coming altogether. It's that fewer people feel compelled to return with the same enthusiasm. A slow shift doesn't make headlines, but over time, it reshapes how a place is perceived. And perception, more than statistics, determines where people choose to travel next. Pattaya hasn't been abandoned. Despite the changes, people still visit, and the city continues to function as a destination. But the type of visitor coming to Pattaya today is narrower than it once was. A large share of current visitors arrive for specific reasons rather than broad curiosity. Weekend travelers come in from nearby areas. Regional tourists plan short stays around holidays. Long-term residents and expats make up much of the daily rhythm. These groups keep parts of the city active, especially at certain times of the year. This concentration shapes how Pattaya feels. Activity now peaks in predictable windows instead of building naturally throughout the week. Some areas feel busy during holidays or weekends, then noticeably quieter outside those periods. For first-time tourists, that uneven rhythm can be confusing. What's missing is the steady flow of casual, first-time international visitors who once gave Pattaya its constant energy. Travelers who used to stop by without much planning. Now choose destinations with clearer appeal or stronger online narratives. Pattaya is less likely to be a spontaneous choice. That doesn't mean the visitors who still come are dissatisfied. Many know exactly what they're looking for and find it here. Pattaya still serves its current audience well. The challenge is that this audience alone doesn't create the same atmosphere the city once had. When a destination depends heavily on a smaller group, it becomes more sensitive to shifts in behavior. If travel patterns change or preferences evolve, there's less buffer to absorb the impact. The city feels more reactive than dynamic. This narrowing of appeal isn't dramatic, but it's noticeable. Pattaya still has life, movement, and visitors. It just doesn't have the same mix of people that once gave it momentum throughout the day and night. Tourism thrives on diversity. When that diversity shrinks, the experience changes for everyone, including the people who still enjoy being there. The real issue facing Pattaya isn't that people never visit. It's that many don't return. For a tourism-driven city, repeat visitors matter more than first-time curiosity, and this is where the shift becomes clear. Most visitors don't leave Pattaya feeling angry or disappointed enough to complain. Their experience is usually fine. They see the beach, explore the nightlife, visit a few attractions, and move on. Nothing goes wrong, but nothing leaves a strong emotional mark either. When a destination fails to create a lasting impression, it quietly slips out of future plans. Pattaya becomes a place people feel they've already experienced. Once that feeling sets in, there's little urgency to come back, especially when so many alternatives exist. Small factors contribute to this. The atmosphere feels inconsistent, the value feels uncertain, the city's identity feels unclear. None of these issues alone are deal breakers, but together they reduce the desire to return. For returning visitors, the decision not to come back often happens unconsciously. When planning the next trip, Pattaya simply doesn't rise to the top of the list. It's not rejected, it's overlooked. In tourism, indifference is more damaging than criticism. Negative experiences can be addressed and corrected. Indifference rarely sparks change because it doesn't create pressure. Visitors move on quietly, and the absence is only noticed over time. This pattern affects perception. As fewer people return, fewer personal recommendations are made, fewer stories are shared. The destination gradually loses visibility in casual travel conversations. Pattaya still attracts visitors, but it struggles to inspire loyalty, and loyalty is what sustains tourism long term. Without it, a destination relies more heavily on new visitors, which is harder to maintain. People don't stop coming to Pattaya because something goes wrong. They stop coming back because nothing pulls them in strongly enough to repeat the experience, and in a world full of choices, that absence of pull makes all the difference. Pattaya didn't disappear, it didn't shut down, and it didn't suddenly fail as a destination. What happened here is quieter and harder to define. The city still operates, visitors still arrive, streets still light up at night. On the surface, Pattaya continues much as it always has. But beneath that, something has shifted in how people respond to it. Pattaya was once a place that pulled people in without effort. You didn't need a plan or an explanation. The energy was obvious and the experience spoke for itself. Today, that pull is weaker. The city asks more from visitors, more patience, more searching, more adjustment of expectations. For some, that's enough. Many people still enjoy Pattaya for exactly what it is today. But for others, especially first-time visitors, the experience doesn't create a strong reason to return, not because it's bad, but because it feels incomplete. Tourism depends on emotional memory. People go back to places that make them feel something specific: excitement, comfort, wonder, connection. When those feelings blur, the desire to return fades naturally. Pattaya hasn't lost its buildings, beaches, or nightlife. What it's struggling with is relevance. Not relevance in numbers or statistics, but relevance in people's minds. In a region full of destinations that offer clearer identities and stronger impressions, Pattaya feels harder to place.